what is going on with Brexit? How close are we to a deal?
Well, look, we've clearly made some progress in recent weeks and days, and it's really important to get this fixed. We know that the Northern Ireland Protocol has created real challenges for businesses across all communities in Northern Ireland. It's posing a challenge to the Good Friday Agreement and, in fact, the integrity of the UK. So I think the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Northern Ireland Secretary have been hard at it. And if we can make some of those changes, which we've been pushing for, to get a shift away, for example, in trade in goods from GB, from Britain to Northern Ireland, from having checks and declarations on individual consignments, towards a more intelligence-based approach to controls. If we can encourage the EU to rely more on market surveillance than those checks, market surveillance, particularly in the Republic, to protect the EU single market, that would, if we can get that kind of deal across the line, mark a paradigm shift in the approach and will be very good news for the communities in Northern Ireland, and I think for the Good Friday Agreement as well.
So you say that there's been progress in weeks and days. It's effectively there, right? Are we talking about Monday? Could it be as soon as tomorrow?
Well, you and I have been discussing Brexit for years now, we always say there's no deal until you've got the whole deal. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
But is that a possibility? It could be tomorrow. I
think there's real progress. We want to make sure all the pieces are in place, but I think hopefully there'll be good news in a matter of days, not weeks. And again, as I say, this will be critically important. It will be a major achievement by this Prime Minister and all those involved, but also mark and pay tribute to the efforts of those that went before. But if we can get this resolved for the people of Northern Ireland, for the businesses, for the communities, and frankly, the manifesto pledge we made really to thoroughly, properly, fully get Brexit done, it'll be a major achievement.
Now, there's obviously lots of speculation going on about what's in the deal. Can you give us a bit of a sense? I mean, you've already sort of touched on a few things there. Are we talking about like a green light system, for example, for goods that are going to remain in Northern Ireland, and then a red light system for ones that will go to the EU? Is that right?
Look, I think the trading goods between Britain and Northern Ireland is critical. And if we can get away from individual checks in the Northern Irish ports and points of arrival and encourage more of an intelligence-based approach.
So is the green light, is that roughly the right area?
Those are the kinds of things, I mean, it's well known that we've been pushing for. And again, encouraging the EU to look at market surveillance, which basically means where they're worried about goods arriving in Northern Ireland, then going into the rest of the EU, including the Republic of Ireland, and posing a threat to the single market, they keep an eye on that. They monitor that through the stores, the shops in the Republic and the rest of the EU.
How about the role of the ECJ, the European Court of Justice? This is a big red line, isn't it, for some people in your own party and also the DUP?
Well, look, there's a number of other things, and I can't divulge all the detail, not least because we want to make sure we get the whole deal done. But what I would say is if we can scale back some of the regulatory checks that apply and some of the paperwork that applies, that would in itself involve a substantial scaling back of the role of the ECJ. And of course, Sophie, the other thing you'll know is this sense that in the irreducible core areas where the EU insists that EU rules need to apply to protect the integrity of the single market, we need to make sure if there are any new rules in the future, there's a proper democratic check, and a proper democratic check coming out of the institutions in Stormont.
That's interesting. So basically, if there are new EU rules, that there should be a way for Northern Ireland to have its say, in a way, over rules that could affect them.
Well, that must be right in any democratic arrangement. And certainly in relation to that, I think we would envisage that that check would be, the last word will be with the democratic institutions. Obviously, the UK government would have a role, and there would be no role for the ECJ in something like that. Now,
you said that me and you have spoken about Brexit before. We have, for years, right, like anyone else in Westminster. And I have to say, you know, you guys obviously think that you've got some significant concessions out of the EU, but this is about politics as well, isn't it? And I just wonder, is there an accusation that Rishi Sunak has been a bit politically naive at not getting the DUP on side already, not getting the European Research Group of Eurosceptic Conservatives on side as well? These are the people you need here to get anything over the line.
Well, look, I was Brexit Secretary back in 2018.
Yeah, so
I've watched it. The one thing I'd say is you've got to be very careful to bring people on board at the right stage, not to divulge the details, not to have, if you like, pressure tactics on all sides, and I say that without aspersion on anyone. What the Prime Minister and the government will be judged by is what we deliver.
Yeah, but you're not going to deliver unless you get people on side. You say that you don't want to divulge the details, but look, we know how this ends. Ask Theresa May. You can think you've got a great deal, but if the DUP don't come on side...
Let's see,
is Rishi Sunak been living under a cave? You know, he must know how these things work.
No, I think what Rishi and James Cleverly and Chris Eaton-Harris have done is very quietly but doggedly pursue the changes we need that will have, I hope, I believe, the support of people going forward. And it will be a massive achievement if we can get that deal over the line. But frankly, the media speculation, you're doing your job, Sophie, and I totally understand it.
But Rishi Sunak has written in the Sunday newspapers talking about the deal, hasn't he?
And he's been very careful to set out the objectives, but also that we're not there yet. But we're obviously in a position where we're close to, on the cusp of a deal. And I think if we can get that deal over the line, it will be...
You think you can? Are you confident?
I'm reasonably confident. We wouldn't be talking about it if we didn't think that there was a good momentum, some pragmatism that we haven't seen before from the EU side. But we've got to get all the pieces in place. But it would mark a great deal for Northern Ireland. We'd protect the integrity of the United Kingdom, and we would fulfil our manifesto.
Will there be a vote? Will there be a vote on the deal in the House of Commons?
Look, let me allow the government to set all of the details out in the proper way. But I think inevitably Parliament will find a way to have its say.
That doesn't sound to me like you are going to hold a vote on.
No, I'm going to just... what I don't want to do, Sophie, is divulge the details bit by bit, drip, drip, drip. But Parliament, of course...
I mean, it doesn't sound like you want to answer that question if there's going to be a vote.
Well, I want to give you a sense of the direction of travel. But, of course, we've got to get the deal at the international level signed and agreed and make sure that the arrangements that underpin it, to the extent that they would require legislation, they would have to go through the House of Commons.
If there isn't a vote on the deal, there'll be uproar on your benches, won't there?
We want to handle this properly and you know, and in the right way. And I think one thing we've learned with meaningful votes and various other things since 2016 and beyond is that you have to carry Parliament with you, and I'm confident we would be able to.
OK. Sky News learned over the weekend that the EU's Ursula von der Leyen was due to meet with King Charles yesterday. Now, that didn't happen for operational reasons, we're told. But can you see how, you know, right as Brexit negotiations come to a head, that could be seen as dragging the monarchy into politics? Well,
the King, the monarch, regularly meets heads of states and heads of leading international organisations. The precise timing of it and the scheduling of it actually is for the palace and for the monarchy to decide. It's not something that we would impinge on. But look, but it is actually a pretty... part of the normal functions of the King would be to meet senior international figures. OK, I want to talk to you a little bit about Boris Johnson. Yeah. He told Sky News this week that the best way forward was his Northern Ireland Protocol bill. Has he been lobbying against this deal? He hasn't lobbied me against this deal, but look, I would pay tribute to what Boris did in relation to the NI legislation, because I do think it has reinforced our hand in these negotiations. The government's position was, under Boris, but also under Rishi Sunak, that in the last resort, we would be willing to unilaterally legislate. And I think that's helped. I would also say, having been involved in both governments, that pushing through the legislation unilaterally without a deal with the EU was fraught with legal uncertainty, because ultimately we'd be legally challenged, including arbitration under the deal that Boris and previous governments
This is interesting, isn't it? Because, as you say, the Northern Ireland Protocol bill effectively allows you to unilaterally override, in emergencies, parts of the deal. Do you think that would have been challenged in the courts, effectively the ECJ having a role in it? Well, I think inevitably it would be legally challenged. I think actually the issue would have been the arbitral tribunal if we'd gone to arbitration on that. And then you don't know what the outcome would be. You could get fined, you could win some of it, not all of it. So it is definitely, and I think successive governments have taken the view that actually, and that's why Boris didn't press forward right the way through with the legislation at the time. The ideal outcome is to get a negotiated solution. But also, I want to be clear, I think the legislation, having the legislation there ready to go, reinforced the negotiators' hands, and I think it was important. But now, time to move on from it. Well, look, if you get a negotiated solution, you don't need to proceed with the legislation unilaterally. OK. Now, we've done an awful lot about Brexit. You are under investigation for alleged bullying of civil servants. Do you have any idea when the findings of that investigation are going to be due? Well, first of all, Sophie, as you know, I've said that I behaved professionally throughout, but I also, when the complaints were made, called for an independent inquiry. The Prime Minister set one up. It is for the independent
investigator, Adam Tolley, KC, to decide all of that, and I won't comment on it further, precisely because I want to professionally respect the integrity of that process.
I understand, of course, that you feel that you don't want to prejudice the outcome of the investigation. We, of course, won't get into details of it for the same reason. But I just want to ask a couple of very factual, straightforward questions on the timeline. When were you first aware that a complaint had been made?
So I've already said this to the House of Commons. The first time any complaint was, I was notified, was the day before, in mid-November, the day before I did PMQs.
Because the Times reported that the first formal complaint was actually made last March. Is that right?
So, not to my knowledge, but Sophie, I'm going to be really careful about this. I've said to Adam Tolley, I've said I'm not going to comment on it, and I wanted to give you a straight answer to a straight question. I'm not going to start getting into the he said, she said of the inquiry. It's not right for me to do so.
When was the first conversation you had with Rishi Sunak about it?
I honestly can't remember, but it would not have been until the formal complaint was made in mid-November.
So that was after you were appointed to the Cabinet under Rishi Sunak?
Yes.
Even though there is this letter the Times has seen that suggests that the first formal complaint was made last March.
Well, look, again...
Not to your knowledge.
What you're doing is inviting me to comment on what is actually part of the subject matter of the inquiry, and I'm not going to do so.
It's just the timeline that I'm
really,
trying to get to.
I know, but it inevitably drags me into that. And look, Adam Tolley will conduct this inquiry. It's already obviously ongoing, and I'll answer, as I said I would, all questions he's got, and there'll be a transparent report. But please don't expect me to answer questions now. It wouldn't be right for me to do so.
Jake Berry, the former chairman, says you should stand down while that investigation's ongoing. Why haven't you done that?
Well, look, I think, well, first of all, that's ultimately for the Prime Minister to decide. But I think, actually, if just by lodging complaints you can knock out a cabinet minister or a senior figure, I'm not sure that's right. We believe in innocent until proven guilty in this country, and look, I'll cooperate fully with the inquiry and I'll respect the outcome of it.
I don't think it's knocking out, though, is it? We're talking about standing aside while some very serious allegations by multiple people are being investigated.
Well, if you believe in innocent until proven guilty, you wouldn't want to penalise people until you've got the outcome. And I could see why that would politicise the process of lodging complaints, because you can effectively, for months on end, remove cabinet members or other leading political figures.
If the complaint is upheld, will you resign?
I'm not going to start speculating on what the outcome might be. Again, you're asking me to comment on the subject matter.
I'm not asking you to comment on the subject matter. I'm asking you to find out what you will do if...
But it's a hypothetical question, Sophie,
well,
so I've got to...
two different outcomes.
Well, look, let's see what the report says. I'm not in control.
If you're cleared, then you won't resign. So what will happen if you're not cleared?
Well, allow me to respond in the right way at the right time. Of course, look, if an allegation of bullying is upheld, I would resign.
OK, thank you. Right, now let's talk a little bit about the brief that you are continuing with the Ministry of Justice brief. So you're announcing today that transgender women who've committed violent or sexual offences will no longer be able to be held in mainstream women's prisons. Talk to me about that announcement. What's the idea? Well,
look, we want to have a liberal, sensitive, tolerant approach to the LGBT community as a whole, and in particular the trans community, who suffer a lot in this country and have high levels of challenges, for example, mental health, bullying and things like that. So I want to be clear about that. Equally, we need to protect the most vulnerable in our society. And I think where you've got trans offenders, trans women offenders, and the suggestion is, or the question is, whether they move into the female prison estate, I think we need to be really clear about protecting the other female offenders, prisoners, in that estate. So we're very clear that from next week we will introduce new rules, which means that any trans offender with their male genitalia intact, or who have been convicted of a sexual offence, and I'm adding to that, if they've been convicted of a violent offence, they will not be allowed into the female prison estate.
Now, this comes after the case of Isla Bryson in Scotland, who's a trans woman convicted of 2 rapes. Is Isla Bryson a man or a woman?
Look, I think it's very clear that she's not a woman in the sense that I've defined it, but that's for the Scottish authorities. In the English and Welsh prison estate, she would not be allowed into the female estate. By the way, just one point of correction, I introduced these changes a while ago. The reason they're coming into force on Monday is because of the time taken to do it very carefully and assiduously.
I want to talk a little bit about the courts backlog as well.
Sure.
This is a huge, huge issue under your department, and it is causing, frankly, misery for so many people who are waiting an unacceptably long amount of time to have their justice heard. I think we can have a quick look at the number of defendants awaiting trial. This is the backlog, the number of people awaiting trial and sentencing, and you can see it's effectively flatlining, if increasing slightly. It's certainly not coming down. And for the first time, rape victims are now facing a typical delay of more than 3 years for their case to be completed in court. This is the rape case waiting time, which, to be honest, I find quite extraordinary, really. How is this in any way acceptable?
So on 3 points. First of all, actually, we were getting the backlog down. Of course, the backlog was caused by the pandemic because the rules meant that you couldn't have jury trials because of the social distancing rules.
It's not coming down, though, is it?
Hold on. So it was starting to come down. We made great progress. Then we had the CBA strike. It went back up. It is now stabilising and coming down. Not as fast as I would have liked it, which is why we're working with the courts. We've reviewed and renewed the Nightingale courts.
Look at the backlog again, please, just to get that graph up again, if possible.
The latest data...
It's not coming down.
It is. So not by a huge amount yet, but actually, if you look at
these are the MOJ figures. Can you just explain to me, am I being really stupid here? Because it doesn't look like it's coming down.
Well, actually, I think if you look at the December versus the November figure, we've gone past...
Oh, right.
Okay. Yeah, we've gone past the peak. It is starting to stabilise. It's coming down not by enough, and that's why we're taking all the other measures that I referred to with the Nightingale courts, with the removal of the limit on sitting days. And in relation to rape, you're absolutely right that those cases are particularly challenging. In fact, I can tell you that we've seen almost a doubling since 2019, but actually the progress has been more recent as well. Since 2019, we've seen a doubling of the number in rape cases.
What is the number?
Sorry, let me tell you.
But just because I've seen this before, the doubling of rape cases.
No, that's not what I said. So let me answer the question, because this is so sensitive and it's so important.
Okay.
We've doubled the number of cases referred by the police, the CPS. We've also seen a doubling of the number of CPS charges and a doubling also of the Crown Court receipts. In the last year alone, rape convictions, the volume, have gone up by 2/3. And
Can we talk in raw numbers? Because I think the problem is, if you say the doubling, it sounds, oh, wow, that's great. But if you're doubling from like 0.9% to 1.8% of rape reports ending in conviction, then that's hardly any, is it? Still.
Well, actually, the conviction rate, I think it's gone up to 69%. But you have to be careful. The conviction rate, properly by the CPS, has measured cases that come to court and that result in a conviction. But look, we're restless to do more. So if I don't want to give you false impression, we want to do much, much more, which is why I introduced 24/7 rape support line, which is why I'm quadrupling the support for victims compared to 2010. When Labour were last in office. We've got this Operation Soteria, prosecutors and police operating much more hand in glove together. And I also introduced Section 28, pre-recorded evidence for the victims, the complainants in rape cases, so that they can do so without the glare of a courtroom. We're making progress, but there is still much, much more to do.
My understanding is, I think it's still, if you report a rape, the chance of you seeing, a conviction is still, I think, less than 2%. And I would also just go back to the original question: is it acceptable that a typical rape cases now, you have to wait 3 years for that to come to trial?
Well, no, we want to get that number down, clearly. And critically, if you come forward, and of course, it's incredibly difficult, not just to be the victim, but then to come and face the whole process of the criminal justice system. And what we want to do is encourage victims and complainants to stay with the process. And the two big things is the expansion of independent sexual violence advisors. And we know that we've got a much better chance of securing convictions if the victims get that support early. And the 24/7 rape support line also means they get the right support as early as possible. We've got much more to do, but again, I come back to the key thing, which is over the last year, the volume of convictions has risen by 2/3. More to do, but we're heading back in the right direction after COVID.
OK, thank you very much.